Hi everyone, welcome back to Night Lectures. For tonight's lecture, we'll be exploring the entire history of ancient Egypt from its earliest beginnings along the Nile, through the long dynastic age of pharaohs, and onward through the slow transformations that carried Egypt into the classical world. As always, you don't need to stay awake for this. You can listen for as long as you like. And if you drift off, that is exactly what this lecture is for. So before we begin, make yourself comfortable. If you'd like, take a slow breath in through your nose and let it ease out through your mouth. And then, just allow your breathing to settle into its own quiet rhythm. If you enjoy these calm night lectures, you're welcome to subscribe, so they're here whenever you need them. And if you feel like it, you can leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, we'll begin. When we speak about ancient Egypt, we are speaking about one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history, a society that endured for thousands of years and which developed an identity so stable and so internally coherent that even when Egypt was conquered by outsiders, its cultural memory continued to shape daily life, religion, art, and governance. Yet Egypt, like every civilization, began in an ordinary way, not as an empire and not as a kingdom, but as a landscape and a river and a pattern of seasons. The Nile River, flowing northward through the desert, is the central fact of Egyptian history. It is not simply a geographic feature, but the foundation of settlement, agriculture, trade, and political organization. To the east and west of the Nile, the land becomes harsh and dry, a wide expanse of desert that, for much of Egypt's history, served both as a barrier and as a boundary, shaping where people lived, where they traveled, and how the state could be defended. But within the narrow strip of fertile land along the river, Egypt was capable of producing grain, raising livestock, and sustaining large communities. Each year, the Nile flooded, and when the floodwaters receded, they left behind a layer of rich silt that renewed the soil. Over time, this created a dependable agricultural rhythm, one that encouraged permanent settlement and long-term planning. This predictable cycle, repeated year after year, shaped the Egyptian view of the world, a view that emphasized continuity, stability, and the endurance of order. Long before Egypt became a unified kingdom, the Nile Valley was home to small farming villages and later to regional communities, each with its own local customs, leaders, and sacred places. Archaeological evidence suggests that, by the late prehistoric period, these communities were growing in size and complexity, trading with one another, and developing early forms of social hierarchy. In the south, in Upper Egypt, settlements tended to be closer together along the river, and their leaders gradually gained influence over surrounding areas. In the north, in Lower Egypt, the Nile spreads into a broad delta, where communities were connected by waterways, and where trade with the Mediterranean world would later become increasingly important. Over centuries, these regions developed distinct identities, and eventually they would be brought together under a single political authority. But that process was slow, and it did not begin with a sudden founding moment. It began with the quiet growth of local power, the accumulation of resources, the organization of labor, and the development of shared religious symbols. Even in Egypt's earliest periods, we see evidence of temples, ceremonial objects, and the beginnings of a visual language that would later become central to Egyptian art. In time, the Nile Valley would become the setting for a remarkable experiment in human governance, where kingship was not only political but sacred, and where the state itself was understood as an extension of cosmic balance. And it is here, in these early centuries of settlement, that the story of ancient Egypt truly begins. As the prehistoric communities of the Nile Valley grew, the patterns of life along the river began to produce something that, in hindsight, looks almost inevitable, though at the time it would have felt gradual and ordinary. The river brought people into proximity. It made trade practical. It made irrigation possible. And it created, in a landscape surrounded by desert, a narrow corridor where communication and competition were constant. Over time, small villages became larger settlements, and larger settlements began to dominate the regions around them. In the archaeological record, we see this development most clearly in what historians call the pre-dynastic period, a long span of time before Egypt was unified under a single ruler. During this period, the people of the Nile Valley were not yet Egyptians in the later sense, but they were already forming the cultural habits that would define Egypt for thousands of years. They produced pottery and tools with distinctive regional styles. They buried their dead with objects that suggest belief in an afterlife. They organized labor in ways that imply leadership, hierarchy, and shared obligation. And they began to build early religious sites, places where the community gathered, where offerings were made, and where the local gods were honored. In Upper Egypt, the southern part of the Nile Valley, several powerful centers emerged. One of the most important was a settlement near the later city of Heracompolis, sometimes called Nekhen, a place that appears to have been a major political and religious center in the late pre-dynastic age. Another was Thinis, near the later city of Abydos, which would become one of Egypt's most sacred burial regions. These southern communities developed strong leadership structures, and they appear to have been more centralized than many of the northern delta settlements. In Lower Egypt, the delta region, the environment was different. The land was flatter, the waterways more complex, and the settlements more spread out. This region had its own cultural identity and its own religious traditions, and it was connected to trade routes that led outward toward the Levant and the Mediterranean. The relationship between Upper and Lower Egypt, even before unification, was not simply one of rivalry, but of exchange. Goods moved up and down the river. Stone from the south, which was more abundant in Upper Egypt, could be transported north. Copper, shells, and other materials from the north and east could be brought south. And in this steady movement, the Nile acted as both a lifeline and a corridor. Over time, as the strongest southern rulers extended their influence, the idea of a unified Egypt began to form. This did not happen in a single moment, but through a process of consolidation. Local rulers gained control over neighboring communities. They formed alliances, absorbed rivals, and established authority over wider territories. As this happened, symbols of kingship became more defined. We begin to see ceremonial objects that depict rulers in stylized forms, often larger than other figures, suggesting status and power. We see early versions of the crown, early forms of royal iconography, and the beginnings of a tradition where political authority is expressed through sacred imagery. And gradually, the Nile Valley moved toward the formation of a state. It is in this late pre-dynastic period that we also begin to see the earliest traces of writing, not yet the fully developed hieroglyphic system of later centuries, but symbolic marks used to identify goods, to record ownership, and to mark important names. These early marks suggest that Egypt's state formation was already tied to administration, record keeping, and the organization of resources. And as the power of the strongest rulers grew, the question became less about whether Egypt would be unified and more about which ruler would be remembered as the one who brought it together. Traditionally, that figure is called Nama, sometimes associated with the later name Menez, though the historical details remain debated. What matters most is that by around the end of the 4th millennium BCE, Egypt entered the period we call the Early Dynastic Age, when the country was ruled by kings who controlled both Upper and Lower Egypt and who established the foundations of the pharaonic state. And from this point onward, Egypt becomes, in a recognizable form, the civilization that would endure for thousands of years. With the beginning of the early dynastic period, Egypt entered a new phase of history, one defined by political unification, expanding administration, and the gradual creation of the institutions that would support the pharaohs for centuries. The earliest dynasties are traditionally numbered as the first and second dynasties, and while the details of individual reigns can be difficult to reconstruct, the broad patterns are clear. A single royal authority now claimed control over the Nile Valley, and that authority was expressed not only through military dominance, but through symbols, rituals, and a growing administrative system. One of the most important developments of this era was the establishment of royal centers. The pharaoh's court, along with the officials who supported it, needed places where resources could be collected, stored, and redistributed. The city that later tradition calls Memphis, located near the boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt, became a key political center. Its location was strategic, allowing the state to maintain influence over both the southern valley and the northern delta. In this early period, Egypt's kings also began to develop a distinctive relationship with the gods. The pharaoh was not yet described in the exact theological language of later centuries, but the foundations were forming. The king was understood as a figure of cosmic importance, responsible for maintaining order and for ensuring that the land remained stable, fertile, and protected. This concept, later expressed through the idea of Ma'at, the balance of the universe, would become one of the most enduring principles of Egyptian thought. At the same time, the early dynasties show us the beginning of Egypt's monumental tradition. The royal tombs at Abydos in Upper Egypt became large and complex. They were constructed with careful planning and often included subsidiary burials, suggesting that the king's death was not only a private event, but a state ritual. These tombs were not pyramids, and they did not yet have the monumental scale of later periods, but they were already expressions of centralized power and organized labor. In the north, in the Delta region, the state's influence also expanded. Egypt's rulers were not isolated from the wider world. Trade connections extended into the Levant, and Egyptian goods and symbols began to appear beyond the Nile Valley. This early outward movement was not yet imperial, but it showed the beginnings of Egypt's role as a major power in the region. Writing too became more developed. Hieroglyphs were used not only for practical purposes, but for sacred ones. Names of kings were recorded, goods were marked, and religious symbols became standardized. This growing system of writing was closely tied to administration, and it allowed the state to manage resources on a scale that would have been impossible in earlier centuries. Over time, Egypt's bureaucracy became one of the defining features of the civilization. Officials were responsible for taxation, labor organization, temple management, and the maintenance of irrigation systems. And although the pharaoh was the symbolic center of authority, the state depended on a large network of administrators, scribes, and regional governors. In the Second Dynasty, the record becomes more complex. We see signs of internal tension, perhaps regional disputes, perhaps rival lines of kingship, and perhaps changes in religious emphasis. Some kings are associated with different divine symbols, suggesting that political authority and religious identity were still evolving. Yet despite these uncertainties, Egypt did not collapse. The dynastic system endured, the state remained unified, and the institutions of kingship continued to strengthen. And by the end of the Second Dynasty, Egypt was prepared to enter a period of extraordinary stability and growth. This next era, the Old Kingdom, is often remembered as the Age of Pyramids. But it was also, in a deeper sense, the age when Egypt's political and religious system became fully mature, and when the pharaoh's role as a divine ruler was expressed through architecture, ritual, and state organization. And so, as we move forward, the landscape of Egypt begins to change, not suddenly and not dramatically, but through the slow accumulation of power, resources, and tradition. The Old Kingdom begins, traditionally, with the Third Dynasty, and it is in this period that Egypt becomes, in a very recognizable way, the Egypt that most people imagine when they think of pharaohs, pyramids, and monumental stone architecture. Yet it is useful to remember that the Old Kingdom did not begin as an age of sudden grandeur. It began as a continuation of the same dynastic system that had already been forming for centuries. The state was unified, administration was expanding, religious symbols were stable, and the king's authority, both political and sacred, was now firmly established. One of the most important changes of the Third Dynasty was the increasing use of stone as a building material for royal monuments. Earlier tombs, called mastabas, were typically built of mud brick, and they were often rectangular structures with sloping sides. But under the reign of King Joseph, the architecture of Egypt entered a new phase. Joseph's reign is closely associated with the construction of the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, a monument that was not only a tomb, but an entire complex of courtyards, walls, and ceremonial spaces. The Step Pyramid is often described as the first large-scale stone building in Egyptian history, and while the details of its construction belong to specialists, the broader meaning is clear. This was a state capable of organizing labor on a vast scale. It was capable of transporting stone, shaping it, assembling it, and maintaining a project that required long-term planning and centralized control. In later tradition, Joseph's architect is remembered as Imhotep, a figure who became famous not only as a builder, but as a wise man, and later, even as a healer. Whether or not the full legend is historical, it reflects the Egyptian tendency to connect monumental achievements with sacred memory. The Old Kingdom, as it developed, was marked by the growth of royal power. The pharaoh was increasingly portrayed as a divine figure, closely linked to the gods. The state's ideology emphasized the king as the guarantor of cosmic order. And the building of tombs and temples was not simply a display of wealth, but a religious act, one meant to ensure stability in both this world and the next. In the 4th dynasty, Egypt entered the most famous phase of pyramid building. This was the era of Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Sneferu, in particular, is associated with major architectural experimentation. His reign saw the construction of large pyramids, including the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, as Egyptian builders refined the techniques needed to create smooth-sided pyramids. This refinement was not only technical, it was also symbolic. The pyramid was not simply a tomb. It was a statement about kingship, permanence, and the relationship between the pharaoh and the divine. Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, built during the 4th dynasty, became the largest and most famous of these monuments. Its scale suggests an extraordinary capacity for organization. It required labor, planning, resources, and administration on a level that only a powerful centralized state could sustain. And around these pyramids, the Old Kingdom created a landscape of ritual. Causeways, temples, burial sites, and administrative centers developed around the royal monuments. The state's religious system was not separate from its political system. They were intertwined, and the pyramid complexes became both sacred and administrative centers. Meanwhile, beyond the royal court, Egyptian society was also becoming more structured. Officials gained status. Scribes became essential. Regional administrators managed resources in the provinces, and the relationship between the center and the local regions became one of the defining dynamics of Egyptian governance. The Old Kingdom, in its height, was stable, prosperous, and confident, but stability itself creates its own patterns. Over time, power spreads outward. Local elites grow stronger, and even in an age of pyramids, the foundations of future change were quietly forming. Over time, the stability of the Old Kingdom began to change. The Great Pyramid Age, for all its confidence and monumental permanence, depended on a strong central state, a steady flow of resources, and a clear hierarchy of authority. But as the dynasties progressed, several pressures emerged quietly and gradually. The cost of maintaining large royal building programs was significant. The power of local officials, especially regional governors, often called nomarchs, grew over generations, and the relationship between the royal court and the provinces became less centralized than it had been in the height of the 4th dynasty. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the Old Kingdom's political structure weakened. Some later traditions associate this decline with the long reign of Pepi II, a king said to have ruled for many decades. Whether or not the reign was as long as later sources suggest, the general pattern is clear. A long reign can create stability, but it can also create uncertainty about succession, and it can allow local elites to become entrenched. As central authority weakened, Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period. This was not an age of total collapse, but rather an age of fragmentation. Instead of one unified state, Egypt became divided among competing regional powers. In the north, rulers based around Heracleopolis held influence. In the south, Thebes emerged as a major center, and across the Nile Valley, local leaders governed their own territories with increasing independence. In later centuries, Egyptian texts often describe this period as one of disorder. Yet the reality was likely more complex. Even during fragmentation, daily life continued, farming continued, temples remained active, and communities still maintained their customs. But the state's ability to coordinate large projects, to enforce uniform administration, and to maintain a single national identity was reduced. Over time, Thebes gained strength. Its rulers extended influence northward, and eventually, Egypt was reunified under a Theban king, traditionally associated with the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is often described as one of Egypt's most balanced and effective periods. The kings of the 11th and 12th dynasties rebuilt central authority, strengthened administration, and promoted an ideology of kingship that emphasized responsibility, stability, and order. The pharaoh was still sacred, but Middle Kingdom texts often present the king as a figure who must actively maintain harmony, not simply embody it. This period also saw a renewed emphasis on literature, wisdom texts, and cultural reflection. It is from the Middle Kingdom that many of Egypt's most famous works of writing survive, including instructional texts and stories that were copied for centuries. Politically, the Middle Kingdom expanded Egypt's influence into Nubia, the region south of Egypt, where the state sought control over trade routes, gold resources, and strategic territory. Fortresses were built along the southern frontier, and Egypt's presence in Nubia became more organized than it had been in earlier periods. In the north and east, the Delta region remained important, and Egypt maintained trade connections with the Levant. The Middle Kingdom state was capable, organized, and resilient. Its administration relied on skilled scribes and officials, and its kings promoted a sense of national identity rooted in the Nile Valley itself. Yet, like the Old Kingdom before it, the Middle Kingdom was not permanent. Over time, as dynasties changed, and as the balance between the royal court and regional power shifted once again, Egypt moved toward another period of division. This would become the Second Intermediate Period, a time when foreign rulers gained influence in the north, and when the unity of Egypt was challenged in new ways. As the Middle Kingdom drew to a close, Egypt gradually entered another phase of political fragmentation. The reasons were not singular, and they were not sudden. Dynastic authority weakened over time. Regional leaders gained more independence, and Egypt's northern frontier, especially the eastern delta, became a point of increasing contact with peoples from the Levant. This era is known as the Second Intermediate Period. In the traditional historical narrative, it is remembered as the time of the Hyksos, foreign rulers who established control over parts of northern Egypt. The term Hyksos is often translated as rulers of foreign lands, and it reflects the Egyptian view of these leaders as outsiders. Yet the Hyksos were not simply invaders in the dramatic sense. They were part of a broader pattern of migration, settlement, and political change in the eastern Mediterranean world. They established their capital at Avaris in the Delta. From there, they governed northern Egypt, while southern Egypt remained under Egyptian rulers based in Thebes. Egypt, once again, was divided. But this division was different from the First Intermediate Period. Here, the north was ruled by leaders who were culturally distinct and whose connections extended outward beyond Egypt. In time, Thebes became the center of resistance and reunification. The Theban rulers of the 17th dynasty gradually strengthened their position, and eventually, Under a king traditionally known as Ahmose I, Egypt expelled the Hyksos from the delta and reunified the country. This reunification marks the beginning of the New Kingdom, the most famous and expansive era of Egyptian history. The New Kingdom, spanning roughly the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, is often described as Egypt's imperial age. Yet it is important to understand the New Kingdom not simply as an era of conquest, but as an era of confidence, centralized power, and cultural richness. The trauma of foreign rule in the north contributed to a new emphasis on strong kingship and secure borders. The pharaoh was presented as the protector of Egypt, and the state became more outward-looking than it had been in the Middle Kingdom. The 18th dynasty began with a sequence of powerful rulers. After Ahmose, Egypt consolidated its control over the delta and strengthened its presence in Nubia. The state reorganized its administration, and the military became a more prominent institution within Egyptian society. Egypt's temples also grew in wealth and influence, particularly those dedicated to Amun at Thebes. The relationship between the pharaoh and the gods remained central, but now the temples themselves became major economic institutions, owning land, employing workers, and shaping political life. In the reign of Hatshepsut, Egypt experienced a period of stability and prosperity. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most famous female rulers, presented herself in traditional royal imagery, including the symbols of kingship. Her reign is often associated with trade expeditions, monumental building projects, and the expansion of temple architecture. After her, under rulers such as Thutmose III, Egypt's influence extended further into the Levant. Egypt became deeply involved in the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Tribute flowed into Egypt. Diplomatic correspondence connected Egypt to other great powers, and the pharaoh's court became a center of international prestige. In the New Kingdom, Egyptian art, architecture, and religion reached a high level of refinement. The temples at Karnak and Luxor expanded. Royal tombs were constructed in the Valley of the Kings, and the imagery of the pharaoh as both human ruler and sacred figure became more elaborate and more standardized. Yet even within this era of strength, Egypt experienced moments of internal transformation. One of the most striking was the reign of Akhenaten, a king who promoted a radical religious shift toward the worship of the Aten, the solar disk. Akhenaten moved the royal court to a new city, often called Amarna, and reoriented religious life away from the traditional temple system. This period was short, and after his death, Egypt returned to its earlier religious traditions. But the episode reveals that even in the height of empire, Egypt's institutions could be challenged from within. After Akhenaten, rulers such as Tutankhamun restored the older religious order, and Egypt continued onward, returning to the patterns of kingship and temple life that had sustained it for centuries. As the centuries continued, Egypt remained, in many ways, the same familiar land it had always been, a country shaped by the river, by the seasons, and by a deep memory of its own past. But the world around it was changing. New powers rose across the Mediterranean, and Egypt, once the most stable and enduring kingdom of the ancient world, became increasingly connected to forces beyond its own borders. There were periods when foreign dynasties ruled Egypt, and times when local leaders returned, and then times again when outsiders took control, and each change came not with sudden destruction, but with a slow adjustment, as daily life continued, and the river still flooded, and the people still planted, harvested, and lived in the rhythm they had always known. Even under foreign rule, Egypt's identity remained remarkably strong. The temples continued to operate, the priests continued their work, and the old religious practices remained visible for generations, sometimes blending gradually with newer traditions, and sometimes existing quietly alongside them. In the cities, especially in later centuries, new languages and customs became more common, and new forms of administration took shape. But the older foundations did not disappear quickly. They lingered. They remained in stone, in ritual, in architecture, and in the way Egyptians continued to think about time itself, not as something rushed forward, but as something cyclical, something returning again and again. And over time, what had once been a kingdom ruled entirely by its own internal logic became part of a much larger world, connected to distant trade routes, imperial politics, and shifting alliances. The Nile, still central, became one artery among many. Even so, Egypt's contribution did not end. The knowledge developed over thousands of years in writing, engineering, agriculture, medicine, and statecraft continued to influence the civilizations that followed, often quietly, and often without recognition. And so, the story of ancient Egypt does not end in a single moment. It simply becomes more distant. It fades gradually, like torchlight growing dim at the edge of a long corridor, until what remains is not an ending, but a presence, still visible in the monuments, in the surviving texts, and in the enduring idea of Egypt as one of the first great civilizations to shape the human world. And for now, you can let that long span of time settle gently in the background, like the slow movement of the river itself, continuing calmly through the darkness.